Okay, Chapter 14 is on the parliamentary systems, as they will be compared to presidential systems, which is the kind of system that the United States has. Keep in mind that a parliament is also a broad generic term for a legislative body. In the United States, our legislative body is called Congress. In other countries, it's called Parliament. So let's look at the main differences. Again, the Parliament is just the elected body of representatives. And you may have heard this term MPs. Well, that's not military police. That's members of Parliament. Somebody in the United Kingdom that you may have heard them referred to as an MP, that's what that means. It's the form of government in about half of all democracies in the world. And the one that we'll be referring to occasionally is Great Britain's House of Commons, considered the lower house of their government. And the bills passed by the Parliament are law. And so we'll see the major differences here between the parliament systems and the presidential systems is that the Parliament has pretty much total control, particularly the majority party or the coalition government, because there is no president that will be signing the bills. The prime minister is the leader of the majority party and has the majority party and the prime minister have considerable control over government while they're in power. The executive power of a parliament is the cabinet that is selected by the ruling coalition, somewhat different from the cabinet that is appointed by the U.S. president and has to be approved by the Senate. Here the cabinet is pretty much put together immediately by the ruling coalition. Here's a map right out of the book, figure 14.1, showing in dark blue here the parliamentary systems around the world: Canada, Great Britain, much of Europe, India, Australia, South Africa. So as you can see, several of the former British colonies are parliamentary systems. We'll talk about presidential systems in the next chapter, which is the United States and much of South America. And there are some systems that have a parliament and a president that are sharing power, such as Russia and France, a couple of other countries out there worth noting that we'll talk about perhaps later. And of course, there's lots of countries out there that are not a democracy, as we've already talked about before. Now, the cabinet runs the operations of government, and it takes the lead in the policy. So the cabinet in a parliamentary system has quite a bit more controlling power. They are running the show, so to speak. They are the administrative body of the ruling party that has won control of the parliament, formed by the majority party members of parliament. And as we already talked about, if no party has a majority, then a coalition forms that would maintain the majority control of that parliament. And the leader of this coalition is called the prime minister, such as in some of these cases that we've already talked about, or chancellor in some systems, or premier in other systems. But they are the heads of the government because of the fact that their party was elected control of the parliament. Now, the cabinet retains its power as long as there is confidence in that government, which means it commands a majority. And there's a few reasons why the government could fall. You may have heard that term, to where the government has fallen. So this is where there's a crease in the coalition, and it ceases to agree, and the coalition splits. So therefore, nobody has majority control of the government, and so the government could fall and result in new elections or a new coalition forming. The majority could potentially shift. So what's happening here is the coalition that's in control of the government is not what was originally intended when it was first formed. So there's something going on that is causing problems, and therefore, another way of putting it, losing confidence in that ruling body. And there could be a vote to unseat the cabinet, which could result in falling government or lack of confidence in the government, or the cabinet could resign for some reason. So the head of the government is the majority party's leader. We've talked about that before when we looked at proportional representation systems, where you're typically voting for a party list, and then if that party becomes the majority, then the head of that party will become the prime minister, the head of government, directs the business of the state, and they would continue to sit in parliament for as long as there is confidence, or if there's a constitution that says that the elections will reoccur at a certain time, then that could possibly be the system as well. The parliament can take a vote of no confidence, which would then spur a new election. The prime minister is also the leader of the cabinet. He has the right to disband parliament and force a new election. Now, we have a fairly recent example of this when Tony Blair in Great Britain stepped down in 2007 due to the lack of confidence over the Iraq War primarily. And then the party selected at that time a new Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, because Blair knew that confidence had been lost in the ruling party and decided to step down, which then spurred a new election. So the parliament system, the ruling coalition or the ruling party has a lot of power, and really they have the opportunity to pass the legislation that they said they were going to pass. There's nobody really stopping them, as we'll see here in a minute. Now, as again, the cabinet is the dominant factor of this parliament because it is put together by the ruling party, and it proposes legislation with debate and puts on the minor amendments. So as you can see, the party has quite a bit of power in this system if they are the majority control of the parliament. Now, this is different somewhat from the presidential system, which has to, the party in control of Congress has to deal with the president's agenda. And if the party of the president is different from the party of Congress, then you have divided government, and there may be more difficulty getting legislation passed because the president has one agenda, Congress may have a different agenda. So part of this party power is that it determines who the leaders are. Again, the prime minister, obviously, is the head of government because he's the head of that party that won control of it. And as we've said before, in these proportional representation, multi-party systems, such as in Great Britain, the party is more of a farm team for government, to where it provides an avenue for advancing up to the ranks through party power. And again, this requires, if you have a coalition that's running the government, it requires a committed coalition, because as soon as that commitment falls apart, then you have lost confidence in the governing body, and then that could result in a major shift, even potentially a new election. Here's some examples of how much control that the cabinet has in the parliament. For example, this count was made in 2006-2007 in the Britain's parliament. 97% of the bills submitted to the House of Commons were approved. That is extraordinarily different than the U.S. system. In the U.S. system, as we'll see, it's the committees that start to hash out these bills and try to get them put together so that it gets out on the floor of Congress. Well, we do know that about 90% of all the bills that are initially submitted to Congress fail before they even get out of a committee. So as you can see right here, the cabinet is controlling legislation, and literally they're not even going to propose a bill if it's not going to get approved virtually. So they're making policy and approving it as they're making it, so to speak. Looking at the number of amendments that are added to the bills, in this particular count right here, virtually almost 100%, that's only 2 out of 1,772 amendments, only 2 of them were not approved that were proposed by the cabinet. So therefore, as you can see, since the cabinet has control of this legislative body, they're not even going to propose an amendment that they don't think it's going to be part of the bill. And only 210 of over 4,000 amendments proposed by other members, that is, members of Parliament that are not part of the ruling coalition. So a very small percentage of those amendments are going to pass. So this provides an interesting contrast between our system. And we complain a lot about our two-party system, but as you can see, in a system like this, you're voting for the party. And if the party's controlling Parliament, well, they're going to do exactly what they were saying that they were going to do in order to get elected, because there's very little opposition. Now, the head of state is in these parliamentary type systems is typically a separate and mostly a symbolic figure, such as a king or a queen of England, for example. These are typically referred to as constitutional monarchs, and they mostly are symbolic and ceremonial. As we see, some countries, Britain, Denmark, Spain, Netherlands, have these constitutional monarchs that are pretty much symbolic and do not have a whole lot of power on policy making. Now, in some of these parliamentary systems, the president is considered more of a symbolic figure and does not hold a lot of power, such as in Germany and in Italy. And then in some of these mixed systems, as we've mentioned before, for example, in Russia, well, it depends on who the power player is. For example, in Russia, Putin, if he's the prime minister, he's in power, and then if he decides to move over to president, he's in power there. That's signs of an authoritarian system in the making, where either president or Prime Minister Putin could be there for life. So what the head of state typically does is carry out these ceremonial functions with very little political power. Now, I apologize for the fuzzy haziness on this little graph here, but this was a very useful little graph that shows the major difference between the parliamentary system here and the presidential system here. Despite being unable to read some of this stuff, you can see that in a parliamentary system, the voters elect the parties who are going to control Parliament. So here's your coalition that's controlling Parliament, and then the party selects the Prime Minister, who is the head of the party, and their cabinet. And so therefore, there's your ruling body right there, and then they guide the ministries in the administrative functions of government. But the control is up here with the Prime Minister and cabinet. Now, with the presidential system, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, the voters elect both the Parliament, which we call Congress, and the President. As you can see with these arrows here, the voters are electing both of them. And you have the checks and balances between these two branches. And in this case, the President is choosing or appointing his cabinet, which then actually has to be approved by Congress. And then the cabinet and the departments, they carry out the administrative functions of government. But you have considerably more checks and balances and separation of powers here, because the voters are electing the president and the parliament separately, to this one covering the legislative branch, this one covering the executive branch. Some of the other functions, the parliament has the debate. In fact, the debate is fairly colorful in these type of systems, because it's kind of an art. The bills evolve through this debate. Again, the ruling coalition is going to have exclusive power, but the opposition can definitely influence what their proposing. And so some of the debate gets quite heated and colorful, but it's all part of the process, and bills evolve as a result. The Parliament also provides scrutiny over the amendments that are proposed, because there has to be some amount of persuasion to put these amendments in, and that's where the opposition party can help persuade whether or not they get in or how they're shaped. Much like Congress in the United States, the Parliament has an oversight function. The entire body can certainly keep a critical eye on the cabinet. And again, the Parliament provides the source for the executive offices, because it all kind of comes out of the same system. Now, the committees in Parliament, this is another interesting contrast. The committees in Parliament do not have the strength or the independence that the U.S. Congress does. And as we'll see here in the next chapter, and we'll talk a little bit more about the legislative branch as well, but the U.S. congressional committees have considerable power in shaping policy, fine-tuning it, honing it, getting out into the chamber. As we said before, the vast majority of bills fail to even get out of committee. So there's a lot of work that's going on in the committees. However, the cabinet does the bulk of that job in the parliamentary system, because otherwise, if you put it onto the burden of committees, this would weaken the central unity of the cabinet, and that's the most powerful feature of this parliament system, is that if you elect a party to be majority control, then they build their cabinet and then they control government with not a whole lot of opposition to speak of. In Britain, these committees are typically ad hoc committees that are set up temporarily for each bill as it comes in. So they're not permanent standing committees like we have in the United States. These are put together, and they're not put together in every case. They're just set up if it feels like that there needs to be a committee to review a bill, and they do not have the same power that the U.S. committees have that can hold hearings and subpoena witnesses. The parliament committees do not do this, and they do not have permanent staff. So that's a pretty big difference between the parliament systems and the presidential systems that have a Congress, to where the committees do the bulk of this work. Now, the upper houses, here's another major difference. In the parliamentary systems, the upper houses have very little political power. They're usually appointed, even symbolic or ceremonial. In the case of the Britain system, the upper house is called the House of Lords, and they are appointed members, usually for political reasons and or ceremonial reasons, or even reasons of prestige or whatever, but they do not have much power. They can delay a bill. If there is some serious opposition to a bill that the House of Commons is planning on proposing, they could potentially delay that bill, but only for a year, perhaps maybe even allowing for some rethinking on the bill or some amendments or whatever. But the House of Commons, which is the elected body of Parliament, can pass the bill a year later without the House of Lords' consent. Again, this is another big difference from the U.S. system of Congress, where our Senate, which is the upper house, has considerably more prestige than our lower house, which is the House of Representatives. The Senate has quite a bit more freedom to debate bills and has the power to filibuster bills. So clearly the Senate, which is the upper house in the United States, has quite a bit of power, whereas the upper houses in parliamentary systems do not. So another interesting distinction. Now, the advantages of the parliamentary systems, we've already discussed a lot of it, because the power is unified. If you are elected to be control of the government, well, you've got unified power to do what you say you are going to do. The party's in power. Now they can do their agenda. Whereas in In the United States, if a president gets elected on a certain agenda, he still has to rely on Congress to pass those bills that he will sign. And if he's got a divided government, that Congress is not going to have a whole lot of motivation to pursue his agenda. Whereas here, there's no president to veto it, and a court can't strike it down. This is another interesting feature in most parliamentary systems, although we are seeing some shifts in this, as we'll see here in a minute, don't have that power of judicial review where the court can strike down a bill. So the responsibility is very clear in these parliamentary systems. And as a result, you can't shift the blame. Voters know exactly who to blame. And if they lose faith or lose confidence, then the government could fall apart and a new election could put in another party in power. Whereas in the United States system, we have lots of blame to go around. Everybody can point fingers at another branch. We can say, oh, let's appoint judges to pass policy by striking down laws, or let's delegate this to the president so that we can blame him if it goes wrong. Or the president can say, I can't do anything because my hands are tied because Congress won't give me any bills. So lots of blame to go around in our U.S. congressional system, and very clear responsibility in the parliamentary systems. Now the disadvantages, the minority party does not have a whole lot of protections. They could get pretty much just run roughshod over until something occurs that could potentially put them back in power, such as with a war that goes badly or an economic meltdown. Yes, that typically evokes change in almost any system. They're not really able to slow down hasty action in a parliamentary system, and even if it did not have broad support, it could get put through. Now, this is a potential advantage in the U.S. congressional system, is that it is more deliberative. It might take longer and more incremental to get policy out. And here, if you have a party in power, they could put a lot of policy into play because they can. And then if that government fails down the road, you could have a lot of retraction of policy because a lot of it was pushed through perhaps a little hastily. And of course, we've already talked about the potential for an unstable government if there's a coalition that needs to be in place for a majority. And that coalition could fracture along those party lines. And we've already talked about how some countries, such as Italy, have had many different coalitions over the past decades. Now, the book talks about the consensus parliament systems, and this is somewhat of a hybrid that tries to bring up some advantages of both systems as far as president and parliament. These are more prevalent in neo-corporatist states where they're trying to get the business sector a little bit more incorporated into policy making, or proportional representation election systems. So, as we've already talked about a little bit with the neo-corporatist form of interest groups, that there's more emphasis on negotiation and compromise among the parties so that one majority party doesn't have so much control, and also using part of the political process through royal commissions to where the head of state or the royal side can actually have a little bit more say through appointed commissions and recommendation on policy. And so also with the consensus systems, you're seeing policy that is potentially more consistent with the changes in the cabinet. However, just as we've already talked about with the U.S. congressional system, if you start spreading it out a little bit more as far as who's involved in the process, then there's more difficulty to accept accountability or to prevent pointing of fingers and blaming other people. So then again, that's the trade-off. That goes right back to the authoritarian versus democratic systems. Democratic systems are messy because people have their say and leaders are held accountable. Authoritarian systems, the leader can do whatever he wants, doesn't really matter, may not even care about criticism, but of course they are not as typically successful as a result of that. Germany is a consensus parliament system that the book talks about. A few more checks and balances. Again, the upper house given a little bit more power to appoint, to be appointed by the state government. So they're using more of a federalist type system here to help appoint their upper house. And the upper house is now able to block bills rather than just delay them. Germany has also allowed the process of judicial review to where you could potentially strike down, the courts could strike down a bill if it is deemed unconstitutional, and starting to see a few more standing committees to scrutinize bills rather than the cabinet having total control over it. And again, you've got the possibility here where the ruling party is not going to be held as responsible. So that could be a again, another trade-off as to sharing of power, but yet getting a little bit more messy as to who to hold accountable. And then one more thing here, they're authoritarian parliament systems. The book talks about China's National People's Congress, since it is authoritarian, I guess you could say an evolution of the Communist Party, pretty much in name, since it is kind of a controlled capitalist system. But China's People's Congress is not an elected body. You have to be a member of the Communist Party, which we've talked about a little bit before, and in the single party authoritarian systems. And so therefore you got to be a member of the club, so to speak, and very selective and very secretive. And in China, the People's Congress meets only once a year for 2 weeks, and then every few years they will secretly elect a new leader. And of course, bills will always pass and appointments are always approved in this authoritarian parliament. Of course, we do not necessarily see or know how that is done, that it's just because it's done behind closed doors amongst the very, I guess you could say, exclusive party members. But they do allow some occasion for debate and feedback. However, not a whole lot through a independent press or through a democratic voting process, a referendum process, or even a petition type process. It's also done somewhat internally. Now, the authoritarian parliament also, particularly in China, provides a symbol of a unified nation. And even though there is unrest, and perhaps even growing unrest in China because of the authoritarian system, it is a fairly homogeneous culture, and if their economy continues to improve, and they feel like that the leaders are making good decisions economically as far as the future of the country, they may be able to quell some unrest. It'll be an interesting situation to see how China evolves with an authoritarian system and under a controlled capitalist system. And I'll give you a little bit of feedback on what to focus on for the quiz.